Radioactivity is merely the reversing of the time dimensions of the universal constant. It is the exothermal exhalation of the one universal being, of which every existing thing is. The more positive the system or mass, the more generative and radioactive is that system. The more generative the system or mass, the more cohesive it is. Cohesion is born of generative, decelerative, gravitative, centrifugal force. The more radiative the system or mass, the less cohesive it is. The more cohesive the system or mass, the more compact it is. It is what man describes as harder, which means more impenetrable. The atoms of all of the hard and closely integrating elements have ejected magnetism with greater speed and in smaller streams than the atoms of the less closely integrated elements. Resistance to integration is the cause of this increased speed, and the contracted atomic volume is the cause of the smaller magnetic stream. It is as though a certain volume of water which had been pumped through a 4-inch pipe had to be pumped through a 1-inch pipe in the same amount of time. To do this, the pressure behind that volume of water would have to be vastly increased, and the speed of the smaller stream would also have to be vastly increased. Resistance to integration has generated much heat which in its turn has been radiated, thus reversing the magnetic pressure from the magnetic field within the system to the magnetic orbit outside of the system. This process has gradually cooled the systems by the pressure released from within and the consequent radiation of their heat, and allowed them to become more densely packed so that their more closely rotating units could create the illusion of solidity or hardness. Hardness is due to deceleration of rotation and acceleration of revolution, which allows a closer integration of light units in their systems. It might be said, concerning the illusion of solidity, that if a cobweb could be woven with sufficient density and revolved with sufficient rapidity, it would appear to be a solid disk of silver. Generativity is the opposite of radioactivity. Generativity is the resistance set up against one time dimension of the universal constant in order to transform it into power. It is the endothermal inhalation of the one universal being. The positive force of motion in opposition is that which produces all idea of thinking, mind, and gives it the appearance of form. The negative force of motion in opposition is that which tears apart the appearance of form and carries the soul of it or the memory of it back into motion in inertia. The union of these positive and negative forces of motion in opposition reverses radiative dominance to generative dominance, and thus causes a reproduction of the ideal and the form of the ideal through reintegration. The positive electric force is the creating force. The negative electric force is the decreating force. The union of positive and negative is the reproducing force. Reproduction means the reintegration of form back into that octave in which it has once appeared, but from which it has disappeared by disintegration into motion in inertia. In motion in inertia, the soul of all idea awaits regeneration. The soul of all idea is registered in the seed of ideal. In the seed of man is the whole of man, and so also the seed of all ideal. All ideal and all form of ideal is electrically conceived and electrically evolved to its highest limitations of potential. It then becomes magnetically dissipated and devolved to its lowest potential. The desire of electricity is divisibility of the indivisible mind substance into parts. Electricity craves separation from magnetism. Electricity desires itself alone and shares company with magnetism only because it is fatigued by resisting it. Electricity would tear the mind substance apart in its desire to materialize divine idea into form It would make of this universe one solid, non-elastic mass if its desire could be gratified. Now, it must be remembered that the substance of mind is a perfect, homogeneous, indivisible one. Electricity cannot separate from magnetism, and its attempts to do so give only the appearance of separation into parts. Magnetism does not desire companionship or union with electricity, nor does it desire its own continuation as a separate force. It desires to extinguish electricity as a separate force by separating its particles. Its own extinction would be the consequence of the gratification of this desire. Magnetism desires an equilibrium of motion and absolute inertia, while electricity desires action, and is not concerned with the reaction which adjusts that action in an equilibrium of motion in opposition. The force of electricity is the generative, centripetal force of contraction into the appearance of form. It is the opposite of the reactive force of magnetism, which is the force of radiative, centrifugal expansion into the disappearance of form. Evolving matter, or ideal or form, is electrically preponderant. This means that positive charge predominates. Devolving matter, or ideal or form, is magnetically dominant. This means that negative charge predominates. Evolving appearance of form in matter is a periodic integration due to positive electromagnetic opposition, in which the generative force of electricity is preponderant. That which man calls growth is merely periodic integration, during which the generative force of positive electricity is preponderant. Devolving disappearance of matter is a periodic disintegration due to negative electromagnetic opposition, in which the radiative force of magnetism is dominant. That which man calls aging or fading or declining is merely periodic disintegration, during which time generation continues but with lessened energy, for the radiative force of magnetism is dominant. The vigor of youth is due to electric preponderance, and the weakening of adolescence is due to magnetic dominance. Youth, the growing period, is the life inhalation period. It corresponds to the first 5 octaves of the universal 10-octave cycle. Maturity is the turning point of the life inhalation period toward its life exhalation period. It corresponds to carbon, the turning point of the universal 10-octave cycle. Aging is merely the life exhalation period. It corresponds to the last 5 octaves of the universal 10-octave cycle. Electricity is always preponderant in all dimensions, but it is both preponderant and dominant in the positive half of the reproductive wave of the universal energy constant. Magnetism is never preponderant, but it is dominant in the negative half of the universal energy constant. Youth is preponderantly generative or power accumulative. Age is dominantly radiative or power releasive. Youth is preponderantly electropositive or integrative. Age is dominantly electronegative or disintegrative. The perfume of the budding rose is a disintegration of the preponderantly generating growing rose. But because of electric preponderance, integration so exceeds disintegration that growth continues despite the disintegration until both forces are equalized in that which man calls death. Just as soon as the gravitative forces of electropositive preponderance have carried the growth of that rose to the 4th gravitational tone of the electrical magnetic opposition, which is the maximum point of inhalation in its life cycle, then magnetism begins to dominate and the rose begins to fade.